Here are the 5 creepiest stories ever shared on Joe Rogan, and they'll stay in your head long after you hear them. In episode 2389, Joe Rogan sat across from comedian Sal Vulcano, expecting laughter, not fear. But what began as a half-told story turned into a confession, a locked room, a sleeping man, and an unseen hand that held on just long enough to change what he believed about death, ghosts, and the spaces that touch us when the lights go out. This is the night Sal Vulcano stopped being sure the world ends at the edge of reason.
He begins with embarrassment, not bravado. A man who makes a living on jokes now apologizing for the story he never finished last time. "I don't even know how great the story is," he says. But behind the shrug sits something that still won't leave him alone. He was living alone then. A small place, the kind of apartment where silence feels heavier after midnight. Routine ruled everything. Lights off, television on mute, door locked. The bedroom lock was habit, his way of shrinking the world to a single safe room before sleep. He suffered from apnea, wore the humming CPAP mask that kept him breathing. Every night he sealed himself beneath blankets until only a hose trailed out, a cocoon of warmth and air. From the outside, he admits, it must have looked absurd. A man mummified by technology, the faint hiss of oxygen the only sound. That night, he wasn't yet asleep. Just before the drift, the TV light flickered blue across the walls, throwing moving shadows over the closed door. Then a sound. Soft, unplaceable. Maybe a click. Maybe the latch. Maybe footsteps. His brain reached for logic. House settling, wind, imagination. But the sound had rhythm, a deliberate movement, not random creak. He froze. Seconds stretched. Silence again. Then pressure. At first, light as curiosity. Something around his exposed hand, the one he'd left outside the covers for a taste of cool air. A fingertip, a weight, then a squeeze. His mind sprinted through explanations. An intruder, a hallucination, a muscle spasm. But the pressure deepened, precise, each increment deliberate, human. He stayed still, terrified that acknowledging it might change what came next. The pressure tightened until pain began, not sharp, just undeniable. 10 seconds, long enough for panic to collect shape. Someone is holding my hand. Inside the cocoon, he strategized like prey. If it's a person, why this? Why not violence? Theft, words? Why just a hand? The logic failed him. He counted silently, building courage for a burst of motion. On 3, he decided he'd explode upward. Before he reached it, the hand released. The air rushed back to normal, but the skin still remembered the shape. He tore the covers aside, leapt upright, heart hammering. The room stared back, empty, ordinary, fluorescent with fear. The door was still locked from the inside. No window open. No sound except the mechanical breath of the CPAP. The machine hissed, indifferent. For a long time he stood on the bed, half expecting the door to move. It didn't. He searched the apartment, every closet and corner. Nothing. The locks were intact. The night outside was quiet. But the imprint on his hand, that subtle ache, felt too real to dismiss. He left the lights on until dawn. Later he told himself he must have dreamt it. But he remembers being awake, so awake he could count heartbeats. There had been no drift, no slipping consciousness. Just the light, the hiss, and that unseen palm. When he finally told the story, Rogan did what Rogan does. Pushed the mystery open wider. Maybe it wasn't a ghost, he said. Maybe it was something else, something that doesn't use doors. He joked first, but beneath the humor was curiosity that belongs to anyone who's ever doubted reality. What if it wasn't a spirit, but an observer? Sal laughed, uneasy. "Why would aliens squeeze my fingers?" he asked. Rogan grinned. "Maybe they thought you were dying in there. You're wrapped like a sarcophagus with a tube coming out. They checked your pulse." The studio filled with laughter, but only partly. Because behind the absurdity lingered an old idea. Visitors that come in still rooms, paralyzed bodies, observe. Sleep paralysis stories. White-faced figures standing at bedsides. Shadows pressing on chests. Rogan recounted another friend's experience, awake but frozen, something looming over him, featureless and close enough to taste the air it moved. They called it the sleep paralysis demon. Others call it abduction. The overlap between nightmare and event is thin. Sal listened, weighing the line between ridicule and relief. It helped to imagine it was anything but a ghost, a mechanical thing, a cosmic misunderstanding, even compassion from something alien. But when the laughter faded, the silence after told the truth, he still didn't know. Because logic has limits. The locked door argues for safety, the body disagrees. Science can map brain waves, but not the moment when a man feels fingers that aren't there. Maybe it was muscle memory, a cramp, the nervous system misfiring as consciousness dipped. Or maybe it was a footprint from another world that doesn't obey doors or walls. The story spreads because everyone has a night that doesn't fit their language. A glimpse in the mirror, a whisper without source, a weight on the chest that science calls paralysis, but the soul calls visitation. Each version finds its audience. Some dismiss it, some build religion around it. Sal just tells it as faithfully as memory allows. The door locked, the hand reel, the release timed like thought. And the mind, desperate for reason, sketches possibilities. A dream mistaken for waking? A trick of circulation? A prank of gravity and fear? Or a contact, small, polite, fleeting, from something that watches, testing the boundaries of human sleep? In the months after, he'd still lock his door, still sleep under the blanket tunnel, but now with an extra glance toward the corners before lights out. Not fear exactly, more a negotiation. With the unseen, you stay on your side, I'll stay on mine. But even as he said it aloud, he knew boundaries meant little in whatever world had pressed its fingers into his palm. Ghost or alien, dream or truth, the event became a scar of uncertainty, the most human scar there is. It changed nothing about his life except the silence that followed when he tried to fall asleep. Silence has texture now. It's the sound of the question he'll never answer.
He still laughs when he tells it, but the laughter carries a tremor. A locked door, a quiet room, and a hand that shouldn't have been there. 10 seconds that rewired certainty. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. And somewhere between the two, Sal Vulcano still waits for the squeeze that proves which world he's living in. In episode 2213, Joe Rogan spoke with wildlife biologist Diane K. Boyd, a woman who has spent decades alone among wolves, snow, and silence. She lives where maps end and the wilderness begins, a place where superstition and science share the same firelight. But on one winter night, her years of logic met something colder than instinct. 2 human shadows moving through the trees, calling her name in the dark.
Diane Boyd has lived her life by evidence tracks in snow, data on movement, the sharp order of predator and prey. For years, she's studied wolves in the remote corners of Montana and the Canadian border, places where the nearest neighbor might be 100 miles of forest away. She believes in what she can measure, but she also knows that the wilderness has its own language, one that doesn't fit neatly into charts. She calls it intuition, the old, buried sense that hums beneath logic. It's the thing that stops you before you step outside, the wordless warning that rides up the spine long before reason catches up. In the woods, you listen to that voice or you don't come back. It happened to her twice in her life. No evidence, no sound, just a feeling like static in the air that said, "Don't go out there." And she obeyed, though she couldn't explain why. That's the paradox of living alone in the wild. You become a creature among creatures, reading danger the way an elk reads wind. But the night that truly marked her, the night she later wrote about after decades of silence, wasn't about wolves or weather. It was about people. She had built her small cabin on a slope of frozen timber country, snow high against the window frames, dogs sleeping heavy at her feet. Outside, the wilderness folded into silence. Then, from nowhere, a growl. The dogs rose in unison, ears forward, muscles taut. Their sound was not play, it was warning. When Diane looked out through the frost-glazed glass, 2 shapes moved against the white. Men. At first, confusion. No one visited unannounced in winter, not where temperatures could kill by dawn. Then she realized they were watching her, their heads turned toward the light of her cabin window. And then came the sound that froze her more than the cold, her name. Spoken by strangers. She had worked with loggers that season, cutting and trimming at the border, landing a rarity in those days. A young blonde woman working alone with a chainsaw, among men hardened by miles of forest. Most were kind, a few dismissive, some curious. Apparently, two had followed curiosity into obsession. When she heard her name again, slurred and close, the fear she'd never felt for wolves came instantly for men. Her pulse narrowed to a tunnel. Every survival instinct she'd honed from tracking predators flared, but this was different, human unpredictability, the one species that kills for reasons beyond hunger. She reached for the revolver that felt foreign in her hand. But necessary. She'd always believed guns were tools, not symbols. Tonight it was both. Her only wall between the living and the dead. The dogs barked louder as the men stumbled nearer. Their voices drunk, laughter cutting through the still air. She stepped into the doorway, leveled the weapon, and for the first and only time in her life pointed it at another human being. She didn't shout, didn't threaten, just stood, calm, focused, a predator among predators. The laughter died. They saw her face in the doorway light. Steady as the barrel in her hand, something in that sight changed the air. Whatever reason had driven them there evaporated. They turned and vanished into the trees when silence fell again. It came like a collapse. Only then did the shaking begin, the aftermath of courage. When adrenaline drains and leaves a hollow tremor, the gun lowered, the dogs pressed close, and she realized she'd survived something that would never have a clear name by morning. The sun rose dull through the snow haze. She drove the road out, hands still trembling on the wheel. Old Bob, a logger with the kind eyes of someone who'd spent his life watching. Horizons waved her down from his truck. He'd heard. "I hear you had some visitors last night," he said. She looked up, surprised. "How did you know?" He smiled sadly. "You don't have to worry. It won't happen again." And somehow, it didn't. The forest keeps its own justice. Maybe the message had gone out over CB radios. Maybe the men were warned off, or maybe the woods themselves have a way of closing ranks around one of their own. Years later, writing her book, Diane included the story for the first time. She had never told it before. Too personal, too raw, a private scar under the cold calm of her research career. But to tell her life, honestly, meant telling the truth about fear, because the wilderness teaches that monsters are not what we imagined. Wolves kill cleanly, grizzlies kill with purpose, but people are the unpredictable ones. They wander drunk through the snow calling your name, bringing chaos into places built for silence. That's why, she says, when you feel the hair lift on your neck in the forest, you should listen. The danger is rarely the beast you expect. Joe nods when she says this. That old half-smile of a man who has spent time outdoors and understands what it means to be watched. They talk about the strange psychology of the wilderness, how even the most ordinary sight becomes uncanny when you're alone. A person in the woods looks wrong. He says, a face where no face should be. If you saw a baby standing alone between the trees, it would be terrifying, not because the baby is frightening, but because it doesn't belong. Everything in nature has its place. When something breaks that order, the mind senses it before words form. That, Diane says, is the part of the brain that science can't measure. It's older than thought. The leftover code of survival. Maybe it's smell, maybe electricity, maybe something the body still knows from when we slept under open skies and firelight. The mind has forgotten, but the blood remembers. She calls it superstition. He calls it instinct and truth. It's both. The line where knowledge meets the wild. And on that winter night, it might have saved her life. When she remembers it now, decades later, she doesn't dwell on the fear. She remembers the precision, the silence between heartbeats, the steadiness of her own aim, the loyalty of the dogs pressed at her side. She remembers how even terror can sharpen into something almost holy, the pure clarity of being alive. That moment burned away. Illusion left her with the same understanding. Every predator in the forest shares. Awareness is salvation. She stayed in the wilderness. She kept studying wolves. She built her cabin, Not as escape, but as declaration that solitude and danger are companions worth keeping, because fear, when faced, becomes knowledge, and knowledge, in the woods, is survival.
Outro Diane Boyd still lives among the silence she trusts more than people. The forest never lies, it only warns. Once you've heard your own name spoken by strangers in the dark, superstition stops being a weakness. It becomes instinct, the oldest kind of science. In episode 2033, Joe Rogan sat down with comedian Matt Rife, a skeptic turned seeker of the supernatural. From empty corridors to haunted ships, he's traveled the world chasing proof that the dead can still speak. What began as curiosity became obsession, a search for the moment when laughter stops and the room begins to listen back.
It begins the way most obsessions do, with curiosity disguised as a hobby. A comedian finishes a show, the crowd dissolves into the night, and instead of heading for a bar or a bed, he drives toward a house where the lights don't make the shadows retreat. The door creaks open, the air smells older than the paint, and every hallway feels like an unfinished sentence. Matt Rife says he believes ghosts are possible, not proven. Not certain, possible, and possibility is enough to keep you walking. Recorder in hand, through rooms that feel like someone forgot to leave, he has traveled for it. The Conjuring farmhouse in Rhode Island. The kind of structure that looks harmless in daylight and frowns in its sleep when the sun goes down. He's entered church-quiet mansions, sagging asylums, and the armored belly of a carrier built for war. He has stood still long enough to hear the building talk. Sometimes it speaks only in subtle ways. A toy car rolling off an antique dresser without wind or slope. The soft clatter of a marble across a wooden floor that no one touched. Sometimes it doesn't speak at all. He is proud of that, oddly. Proud that his videos record long hours of nothing. Because the only way to believe the somethings is to honor the nights when the world refuses to perform. He talks about EVP's electronic voice phenomena, not the flashy, staticky radio sweep gimmicks, but the patient method of pressing record and asking a room a question, then waiting. Later you play it back. Sometimes there is an answer. Sometimes there is only the hush between walls. The mind wants to make sense, wants to hear words and noise the way the eye finds faces in clouds. But sometimes the timing is too precise, the syllables too exact, the reply too tailored to the question to dismiss. Even then, he refuses to carve certainty into the air. He is a collector of moments that resist explanation, not a priest. He admits he needs to see it, not once but in a way that leaves no escape hatch for doubt. Rogan meets the obsession with a thought that unsettles the edges of rational ground. What if ghosts are not souls but grooves in time? What if events leave dents in space, pressed so deep by violence or grief that the present stumbles over them like potholes in a dark road? He mentions a thinker who proposed that objects can hold memory, that a place can be a kind of vessel. The idea lands between them like a candle, small, flickering, dangerous. If a room can remember, then entering it is not only walking through space, it is waking something. At the Conjuring house, Rife did not find the screaming, cinematic proof skeptics demand. He found something quieter, a feeling the place had settled into its own truth. The land remembers water, he says, old lines running beneath fields like veins under skin. It remembers war. It remembers bodies laid without prayer, tailies of bones tucked into walls to watch over or to hide. On certain nights, small things obey commands too perfectly. A toy slides when asked. A ball rolls as if invited. He can't put his name on the ledger of certainty, but the timing needles his doubt. He leaves not convinced, but changed. They circle the biggest question. If there is a presence, what is it? A person who stayed behind? A loop fragment of time? A broadcast from human minds so heightened by fear that the environment itself becomes a temporary screen? Rogan speaks of anticipation, of how walking into a place you've been told is haunted primes the body like a bowstring. The heart climbs the ladder. The breath goes thin. The imagination steps forward like a volunteer. And yet, he isn't calling it fake. He's suggesting something stranger, that the mind could be both observer and instigator, tuning itself to a signal that exists whether or not it can be measured by the devices we currently trust. Night is the accomplice. You almost never meet phantoms under blue noon sky, he says. They prefer corners, basements, corridors. They prefer doors that lock and windows that whine with older air. People don't fear wolves in fields the same way they fear being trapped with one in a living room. Architecture becomes part of the haunting, ceilings a little too low, hallways a little too narrow, lights that never cover everything. A house is a machine for feeling trapped. Horror films understand this perfectly. The key that slips, the handle that rattles, the staircase that multiplies your heartbeat. When the geography feels unfriendly to escape, the mind rehearses catastrophe, and the room learns how to listen. Proof, then, becomes not a scream, but a geometry problem. How much of what we experience is physics? How much psychology? And what do we call the residue that remains after both have had their say? Rife answers the only way an honest witness can, by inventory. There were nights with nothing. There were nights when the timing of a sound was too surgical to be accident. There were moments a small object obeyed a request that shouldn't have reached anything but wood. In the Bay Area, aboard the USS Hornet, the lesson changed from farmhouse folklore to steel-boned dread. Rife was sent alone to count to 100 in the dark, an old child's game, turned into a test of courage on a ship that once carried men into the furnace of war. Then he was told to find his friends. Sounds innocuous until the light leaves. Aircraft carriers were built for function, not mercy. Their guts are cross-hatched with thresholds that bruise shins, pipes that stalk your peripheral vision, doorways too narrow to sprint through without thinking. In that maze, the mind maps threats onto every shape. A protruding valve becomes a crouched figure. A shadow becomes a face. And yet something else happens too. The ship's history starts to breathe. Hundreds of men lived and worked there, slept there, bled and were bandaged there. Some never saw shore again. If places hold memory, if iron and paint remember touch and heat and pain, then you would expect a carrier to throb with residue like a struck bell. He describes being hemmed in by bulkheads, unsure if the next step is floor or gulf. Alone, with no quick exit and only the vague map of a tourist's curiosity, the human animal inside him woke up hard. The corridors refused to resolve into safety. In that state, imagination doesn't only invent, it becomes a sensor array, a set of antennas searching for pattern in the dark. Is that sound a friend? Is that breath my own? In the lowest decks, where the sea sounds like a body turning in sleep against the hull, he felt watched by something that wasn't malevolent so much as heavy with attention. Rogan brings the thought back to first principles. Maybe the mind opens a door it did not build. Maybe the biological alarm system, the one that kept our ancestors alive when the night carried teeth and claws, can still tune to frequencies we don't measure. Call it superstition if you need to. He prefers to call it an unquantified sense older than language. That reads a room the way a Wolf reads wind. Rife agrees on the only piece that matters. Fabrication poisons the well. If you fake a door opening, if you string fishing line to make a toy car roll, you're not only lying to an audience, you're spitting into the quiet work of the nights that truly offer nothing. He prefers the monotony, the hours when the only thing keeping you company is the idea of company. Because when the rare thing does happen, when the object moves like an answer, when the recorder plays back a whisper that fits the question you asked, when the knock lands in the beat you bargained for, the value is multiplied by the honest majority of emptiness. But emptiness is not absence. A house with no visible visitor can still be crowded. If Rogan is right that memory clings to matter, then perhaps certain rooms are crowded beyond fire code by the weight of what occurred there. Not souls pacing, but grooves worn by repetition. The way a stair knows 1,000 heels. The way a railing grows polished under 1,000 worried palms. Perhaps our attention abrades time in the same way. Leaving streaks that later minds can feel, the conversation turns toward the ethics of disclosure in real estate, the persistent human conviction that if a tragedy happened in a home, the next owner deserves to know. The law recognizes what science does not yet measure. A murder in a kitchen marks the tiles beyond calcium and stain. Even believers in nothing at all hesitate when told a life ended under that roof. Whether it is fear of an intruder who has already left or respect for a gravity that remains, we intuit that event imprints place. We are less afraid of the dark than of what it remembers. Rife tells the truth that horror channels rarely confess. Most investigations are dull. Hours of static and stale air, camera batteries dying for normal reasons, footsteps that are the house resettling into the cold. Expectation hums anyway. We carry our own haunted houses inside our ribs. We walk into these places loaded with story. Every fame-haunted location has a biography louder than the wind through its eaves. That is not a flaw. It is part of the instrument. The mind brings the bow. The building brings the string. Something else provides the rosin. There is a difference, though, between suggestion and performance. Anxious breathing does not slide a toy across a dresser against pitch, gravity, and balance, not twice, not on request. The story doesn't let those anomalies become kings. It files them carefully, acknowledges them as rare, refuses to build a temple upon them. Sober belief is not an altar. It is a shelf where a few hard-to-classify objects are kept, dusted, revisited in better light. The question of day versus night will not leave the table. Why so few reports under blue sky? Perhaps because daylight equalizes space? The eye sees the edges of the room and writes safety between them. Night narrows the field and concentrates fear, and in that concentration strange things condense. Or perhaps the sun dilutes whatever density memory needs to appear. The answer is uncooperative. It stays where it is, at the threshold where physics, psychology, and folklore shake hands and pretend not to notice. Consider the ocean of a ship's lower decks again. Thick air. Long compartments, pipes that ring, cables that hum, decks that echo your footfalls back with a delay like another person answering yours. The USS Hornet is a cathedral of repetition, drills, orders, launches, alarms, recoveries. The material remembers patterns even if the mind does not. Rife's fear there was not childish. It was a mature recognition that the body is not designed for that maze. Predators hunt where the geometry favors them. In such a place, if there is anything at all that wants you to feel watched, your biology will do the rest of the work on its behalf, Rogan's larger thought, hangs like a banner over the entire discussion. The mind is not only a camera. It is a participant. It generates fields, not metaphysical in the mystical sense, perhaps, but networks of attention and anticipation that change behavior, posture, breath, choice. Two people enter a room convinced it is haunted. They stand still in a way nobody stands still in a grocery store. They whisper. They wait. They ask permitted questions. Is someone here? Do you want to speak? If there is a phenomenon that requires a cooperative posture, a tuning, a willingness, then those very behaviors are the price of admission, and yet the opposite is also true. The dignified skeptic who refuses the room's terms is not the enemy of truth. He is its conservator. The nights when nothing happens protect the rare nights when something does. They also protect the investigators from themselves. The easiest ghost to create is the one that hides inside the desire to meet one. Rife's stories end, as all real stories do, not with a full stop but with an open door. He has been scared in ways adrenaline junkies will recognize: head buzzing, feet tingling, skin keyed to every draft. He has been bored. He has been rewarded by moments that cling to memory like burrs on a pant leg. He has walked out into the morning shaking his head not only at a toy that moved, but at the idea that a building could answer a question it wasn't supposed to hear. In the end, perhaps the most honest sentence in the entire conversation is this: I'm obsessed. Obsession is a compass. It points not north, but toward the boundary where knowledge thins. The Conjuring House offers a pastoral version of that boundary, a farmhouse layered with rumors, water beneath and bones within, the past stacked like cordwood behind its walls. The Hornet offers the industrial version: history, literally welded into place, a machine that carried life and death on its back and then was told to go quiet. In both spaces, The unmeasured becomes a curve in the air that you keep walking as if a straight line still existed. If the mind makes some of it, fine. If matter holds some of it, stranger still. If a whisper on an EVP once matches the question on your tongue with a word that shouldn't be there, then the world is at least marginally larger than yesterday. That is enough to keep driving after midnight, enough to keep counting to 100 in the dark, enough to stand alone in a room where every floorboard feels like a nerve and ask a question no sane person wants answered? Who's here? The only unforgivable act in this line of work is counterfeiting wonder. Everything else, fear, doubt, theories that crackle and fail under scrutiny, is part of the ritual. You wait. You listen. You mark the small hours with the sound of your own breath. You accept that you may be plumbing not only the house, but your own depth, the place where memory and expectation braid into something the recorder might, on a patient night, translate into a syllable. There are other maps, other metaphors. Some say the past bleeds through thin places. Some say human attention is a solvent that loosens paint so old scenes peek through. Some say we inherit more than genetics. We inherit the theater of fear and rehearsal that taught us to survive close spaces with predators. In that theater, a ship's passageway becomes a mouth, and the only way out is forward through teeth. Rife is not trying to convert anyone. He is trying to honor the possibility that the world offers a second vocabulary for the same place. In one language, a ball rolls because of slope. In another, the ball rolls because you asked. The first language is necessary, rigorous, good. The second might be foolish, or it might be the voice of a room that remembers. Between them stands a man with a flashlight, his breath a small cloud in colder air, deciding whether to press record. Maybe one day a camera will capture a figure that walks and speaks and refuses error. Maybe that day will never come, and belief will remain a private contract between a place and a person who once heard his own name in a house that was supposed to be empty. Until then, the work is simple. Go. Watch. Wait. Leave when the sun breaks the windows open. Return when the light has had enough of you. Acknowledge the dull nights, like tithes. And on the rare night when the world tips its hand, don't call it proof. Call it what it is. A reminder that we live in a universe where doors exist that we did not install, and some of them open inward.
Maybe ghosts are people, maybe they're places. Maybe they're the shape our attention gives to rooms that remember. What's certain is the pull. A locked door, a dark corridor, a question whispered into old air, and the answer that sometimes returns, faint, timed, and just convincing enough to make you come back. In episode 1518, Joe Rogan sat down with artist and traveler David Cho, a man who's lived more lives than most people imagine. From the back seats of strangers' cars to the forgotten corners of the Deep South, his story is a collision between invisibility and survival. This is the journey of a boy who was never seen until the world finally looked back.
Before fame, before murals, before microphones, David Cho was a ghost. He grew up quiet, the kid in the corner no one noticed, invisible even in rooms that were supposed to hold his name. Girls would talk about every boy in school except him. Teachers would look past him. It wasn't shyness. It was absence. But absence, he discovered, could become power. He called it his Asian superpower, the gift of invisibility. When the world doesn't see you as a threat, it lets you in. Doors stay unlocked. Secrets come loose. People open themselves the way they never would to someone they fear. That power would take him farther than any passport. By 15, he had begun to travel the only way he could afford. By thumb and faith, he hitchhiked across America. Every state, every border, every invisible mile. The road became his education. In the 1960s and 70s, hitchhiking was a way of life. By the 80s and 90s, it was suicide. But he didn't believe the fear. If I put my thumb out, he told himself, someone will help me. And someone always did. He learned that the first hour of a ride was ordinary. Small talk, weather, the names of towns. But somewhere near the end, when the driver knew this stranger beside him would soon vanish, truth began to pour out. The last 10 minutes were confessions, affairs, crimes, childhood shame. A kind of roadside absolution. One man admitted he had killed. Another spoke of addiction. Others told stories too twisted to repeat. They unburdened themselves to a boy they would never see again, a confessional on wheels, anonymity for both priest and sinner, but not every story was confession. Some were warning. He remembers one ride like a scar, Louisiana, 1993, a long road through swamp and heat. He and his friend Brian, filthy from days on the road, are picked up by a man who looks like a cowboy pulled from an oil-stained postcard, 10-gallon hat. Boots, the easy smile of someone who means well, or wants to. He says his name is Tom, works offshore, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. He laughs, tells them about shrimp po' boys, offers a place to stay. It's late. The air thick as syrup and a free bed sounds like a miracle. They follow him home. The house is small, filled with movie posters, Die Hard, Rambo, the furniture heavy and old, the kind of southern place that smells like dust and rusted metal. Shotguns on the wall. Bottles of lube on the table. Joe doesn't notice right away. He's just thankful for a showered steam fills the bathroom, the first real warmth in days. When he steps out wrapped in a towel, the man is waiting, frozen pizza in one hand, eyes on the television. A protest flickers across the screen, men holding rainbow flags in San Francisco. Tom chuckles. I'm queer, he says. You don't see me out there protesting. The words drop like a stone. The house feels smaller. Brian, still filthy, still outside the shower, tenses. They look at each other. Should they leave? Should they run? But they're exhausted, lulled by food and air conditioning. The man seems harmless, too old, too tired. They decide to stay the night. They plan shifts. One stays awake while the other sleeps. Joe holds a pocket knife under the blanket, gripping it until his fingers ache. He can see light seeping from the man's bedroom, his silhouette pacing. Midnight, 1, 2, the steps don't stop. Every creak sounds like intent, around 5:30. He senses it, that feeling every animal knows before the strike. The door opens. Tom stands there, watching. Not moving, not speaking, Joe tightens his grip on the knife, and then the man turns, walks out and disappears into dawn. They don't wait. They wake each other, grab their bags. But Brian, always slower, always practical, insists on a shower. He's gone to get food, he says. We have time. Joe wants to scream. Let's just go. But Brian is already in the bathroom, then the sound of tires on gravel. A truck pulling up. Tom walks in holding a carton of eggs. You boys leaving without saying goodbye? He grins. I was getting breakfast. Joe freezes. Knife in his pocket, hands shaking. The man smiles, talking about family, about his job, about the younger worker on the oil rig who hated gay people but didn't know Tom's secret. He starts to confess, the way lonely people do when they know the moment is ending. I saw you boys sleeping on the couch, he says softly. You look so beautiful, so perfect. I thought about touching you. Every word is acid. Every muscle locks. Joe nods, laughs weakly, the survival instinct of a man who can't afford to offend his captor. Moments later, he finds his voice. We should get going. They walk out fast, down the steps. Past the swamp, behind them, children laugh from the neighboring porches. Old Tom's trying again. One of them calls, and in that laughter, the truth. This wasn't his first time. They run until the road opens wide enough to breathe again. And that was it. The only moment, after years of hitchhiking around the world, when Joe truly believed he might die, yet he didn't stop. He still believes in people. The bad one, he says, was just 1 in 15 years. The rest were good, kind, curious human. They told him stories no one else had heard. And he carried those secrets across the country, like contraband wisdom. That's what invisibility gave him access when people underestimate you. They show you who they are. He saw the best and worst of humanity from the passenger seat. Murderers, runaways, dreamers, saints. Every one of them believed he would vanish when the ride ended. And they were right. Years later, sitting across from Rogan, Joe looks back on it all, The long roads, the near-death nights, the strange kindness of strangers and laughs. I might be the most American person alive, he says. I've been to every state, every country, every road, and it was all free. But the story doesn't end with travel, it ends with reflection, war. He tells Rogan works the same way as hitchhiking, people thinking they've won, never realizing everyone loses. He's seen it in faces, in places. In the aftertaste of violence that never leaves, you can't bomb memory. You can't erase pain. You just move it around until someone else carries it. That's why he still believes in empathy, in listening, in letting people speak their darkness into the air so it doesn't rot inside them, because silence, he learned as a boy, can be a kind of death, but it can also be the thing that keeps you alive.
For David Chu, invisibility was never weakness. It was freedom. It let him see the country the way no map could draw it, raw, haunted, and honest. He learned that danger doesn't always wear fangs. Sometimes it wears kindness, and the only real weapon worth carrying is awareness. In episode 1299, Joe Rogan sat with investigative author Annie Jacobson to open one of America's darkest sealed files. The setting is post-war, smoke still drifting over Europe, tribunals drafting history, and a new Cold Dawn hunting for rocket fire and secrets. Between victory and fear, the United States made a bargain: bring Nazi genius to our laboratories and leave their crimes to the shadows. This is the story of Operation Paperclip, how the path to the moon was paved with documents stamped in black ink and moral ash.
The Second World War ended with parades and gallows, with uniforms burned and insignia buried under rubble. But it did not end cleanly. History rarely does. The front lines straightened into borders, while new battlefields, paper, policy, research rose behind closed doors. The Allies put names on lists, drew up indictments, and promised the world that justice would not harden into mere triumph. It would be a reckoning. And then, quietly, the Cold War arrived like a draft beneath a locked door, and everything that had seemed certain began to blur. Operation Paperclip was born in that blur. The premise was bald, almost vulgar in its simplicity. If we do not seize the Reich's best scientists, the Soviets will. If we do not fold their minds into our engines, we will be standing on the wrong shore of tomorrow. Intelligence officers gathered at airfields and prisons with manila folders and new identities, weighing dossiers the way surgeons weigh organs. The men in those files had designed rockets that fell like iron rain, gases that stripped life down to numbers, protocols that froze and drowned and pressured living bodies in the name of knowledge. They had titles: director, surgeon general, chief engineer, that made their signatures worth more than their pasts were allowed to cost. No single figure embodies the contradiction like Werner von Braun. Elegant, brilliant, a man who dreamed of Mars and built the V2 dreams translated into terror by the thousand. He had run a rocket factory in Berlin where the slowest Jewish slave laborers were hanged at the entrance to warn the others that time itself had become a weapon. The moral ledger on his name was thick enough to choke a courthouse, and yet his mathematics were flawless. The result was an American paradox announced in headlines that never said the whole thing out loud. The architect of our Saturn V had once drawn his blueprints under the shadow of the swastika. The Simon Wiesenthal Center would later say that, had he lived to face them, they would have tried him for crimes against humanity. Instead, he walked halls with flags of stars and stripes, and the photographs show him smiling toward the sky. The official count claims roughly 1,400 German specialists were brought to the United States under Paperclip, though any number etched in secrecy tends to be a floor, not a ceiling. The justification was ruthless arithmetic. We will look away from what they did if it gives us leverage against what we fear. Between laboratories on American soil and the Soviet institutes that swallowed their own share of the Reich's knowledge, the map of the future was redrawn not by morality but by velocity. But the war did not drain entirely into superpower vaults. It also spilled into the southern hemisphere. Down in Argentina, whole villages practiced Oktoberfest like a memory that refused to obey borders. German was spoken in kitchens, steins were raised, family photos on the mantle showed uniforms with lightning bolts on the collar. In those towns, the story of the Third Reich did not end with a bunker or a body in Berlin. It ended with a porch light and a stoop, with children raised on the word hero for men the world had marked otherwise. Whether or not television shows find ghosts of emperors in the jungle is beside the point. What mattered was the proven fact of thousands who fled, changed names, and built a second life from the remnants of the first. Paperclip's darkness is not only in who we brought over but in how openly we kept it quiet. For decades, the program wasn't an admission but a rumor, not acknowledged publicly until stubborn journalists began prying the archive doors with the legal crowbar of the Freedom of Information Act. One of them requested materials and received not just boxes of documents but a bill 6 figures for the privilege of holding the state to its own law. The tactic was as old as bureaucracy: concede the letter, punish the spirit, pay and you may read, refuse and the secret remains exactly what the secret wants to be. Annie Jacobsen went further than invoices and photocopies. She crossed oceans into German archives with scholars whose access and language tore the seals from files that history had tried to clean. She found things you cannot quote without feeling the room tilt. Orders that called murder, special treatment, euphemisms tailored to pass through respectable throats, annotations in tidy script where men weighed life against data. She sat with the children and grandchildren of the men whose names are now shorthand for the science of conquest. Consider the rivalry between two Reich physicians, each seeking the Führer's favor like priests competing for a god's ear. Dr. Walter Schreiber, Surgeon General of the Third Reich, master of vaccination programs, a credential that should have meant life saved, not life sorted. He was so valuable that when his presence on American soil became impossible to deny, we did not try him again, we repatriated him elsewhere. A quiet exit into the southern hemisphere where his past could blend with all the other pasts buried there. His rival, Dr. Kurt Blom, ran Hitler's biological weapons program, designed to harvest death from nature at a scale that makes the blood cold. After the war, he stood in the dock at Nuremberg, his professional smile reforged into a defendant's mask. Photographs show the dueling scar slashed across his cheek, a relic of student days when future leaders fenced bare and then packed the wound with horsehair, so it would heal grotesque a face worn as a resume of hardness. He was acquitted. The paperwork said insufficient proof on some charges. The world read something different: usefulness is a solvent. Years later, his son would meet a journalist in the Black Forest and hand over the trial records, saying he did not want them anymore. As if history were an item that could be passed from palm to palm until its weight vanished, those scars tell another story too. When you look at post-war photographs of certain good Germans, sitting in American viewing stands during a launchman celebrated as contributors to the space, and you sometimes see that diagonal line, pink rope across the face. It is a culture tattoo masquerading as a scratch, ruthless, performative, proud. Our institutions made room for it. Named awards after men whose pasts had been paper bleached until only their patents remained. Ask, an administrator's hem and haw, explaining that no one has ever asked that question before. But questions like that do not vanish. They wait. To call Paperclip a rabbit hole is to understate it. It is a series of tunnels that connect laboratories to courtrooms, courtrooms to cemeteries, cemeteries to living rooms in American suburbs, where a scientist's grandchildren play while their grandfather's name remains classified on some page in some box. It is intelligence officers plucking assets from docks at Nuremberg, slapping new names on old faces, reminding themselves over and over that the path to survival is a corridor too narrow for scruples to pass. Not all the names in these files belong to villains. Some belong to victims whose presence in the narrative refuses to be reduced to a statistic. A survivor from Auschwitz once rolled his sleeve up for a reporter and showed the tattoo he had worn longer than any uniform. He had lived because he had been shifted from the death camp to the labor camp Buna, where synthetic rubber was king and suffering was fuel. That factory answered to a chemist named Otto Ambros, whose genius would later be useful to American industry after his conviction. The survivor's entire family was gone. Asked what anything meant, what conclusion could be drawn after all the documents and interviews and tribunal transcripts, he lifted his arm, exposed the ink, and said, "That matters." In that syllable, the neat logic of policy disintegrates. Some evidence is not for courts. It is for conscience. From that tattoo, the narrative threads back to laboratories where other chemists, before the Reich and then inside it, built the foundations of the modern world. Fritz Haber wrestled nitrogen from the air and fed the planet. He also proved how gas could multiply the reach of artillery, and his work burrowed forward into the canisters labeled with a letter that split into A and B depending on whether you wanted to be warned by smell or surprised by death. He was Jewish and brilliant and believed that science sat above the crude categories men invent when they need an enemy. The Reich taught him otherwise. He fled and died trying to reach safety, the taste of contradiction still in his mouth. In that life you see the entire century compressed. Salvation and horror share a laboratory bench more often than we want to admit. The political machinery that absorbed the Reich's expertise was not improvised. It was strategic. The Allies executed the highest peaks of the regime and imprisoned many others, sending them to cells in a Bavarian fortress whose walls still held the cold. But geopolitics is a patient negotiator. As Germany shifted from occupied territory to bulwark against the East, administrators in American offices took meetings and signed releases. Some sentences were commuted, some bank accounts restored. Villas retitled to sons who claimed ignorance of their father's crimes and enjoyed the view from terraces, built with money earned in factories that ran on ash. Try to knock on the door, and you learn what another system values above all: privacy. The law, local and proud, will tell you that the past is not for you to inventory. All of this happened while the public story of America pointed its cameras toward a new holy land, Cape Canaveral. Engines waking the sky, astronauts grinning under white helmets. The launch pads were altars of a new faith in the possible. Above them hung the invisible scaffolding of compromise. We do not like to imagine that victory sometimes brings home pieces of the world we claim to defeat. But the film reels and the internal memos share a truth. Our race to the moon began in a gray zone where justice and necessity called each other by first names. This is not a tale asking whether we would be better off without the microchips and medicines that grew from the mines we imported. It asks a simpler, heavier question. What happens to a nation when it chooses not to look directly at the cost of its advantages? We tell ourselves there were good Germans, that the empire of the mind can be neatly separated from the empire of the camp. Yet none of the men in those files ever offered the kind of remorse that clears a throat for forgiveness. They spoke instead about competition and destiny, about the elegance of a trajectory or the purity of a process. You can be brilliant and evil. You can be brilliant and cowardly. You can be brilliant and very, very useful. The reason the Second World War still haunts more than any other is not simply the footage, the reels of flags and tanks and crowds saluting in unison. It is because the conflict pressed modernity against barbarity until they became, for a time, indistinguishable. Laboratories were run like armies. Armies were run like laboratories. The bureaucratic calm with which special treatment could be typed into a margin is the calm with which a grant proposal can be stamped. A visa approved, a statute waived. Civilization does not unravel in screams. It loosens one euphemism at a time in the studio discussion. Questions keep returning like tides. Did the imported men ever reckon with themselves? Did they wake at night and see the faces of the people who paid for their breakthroughs? Or did they allow the new applause to drown the old silence? We do not know, and perhaps that not knowing is the truest measure of the bargain. We bought their silence along with their skills, and in exchange we offered them ours. We rephrased their biographies until they matched the needs of a new era, the practical mechanics of paperclip the flights. The cover names, the ranch houses near test ranges, and the quiet government cars are a spy novel's furniture. But the moral is a plain wooden chair, unadorned. Waiting in the corner of an otherwise busy room, we believed we could amputate culpability and graft genius. The patient lived. The scar remains. And Annie Jacobson's path through this history is lit not only by documents but by the faces of people who carry the residue forward, a son in the Black Forest, who does not want his father's papers anymore. A survivor whose tattoo is a sentence that cannot be edited. Administrators in Florida explaining an award named after a man with a scar and a past. An investigator calculating how to pay for copies of the very truth the state insisted she had the right to see. Between them runs a single thread: memory is a force of nature. You can damn it, price it, rename it, but it cuts its way back into the open in the end. Paperclip is not a conspiracy. It is a confession we make to ourselves about what we will accept when the stakes are high enough. It is the scaffolding behind the photograph of a Saturn V rising, the shadow beneath the applause on a launch day when everything worked as planned. It asks whether winning can be trusted to purify the means that made victory possible. It answers. In the quiet of an archive room where a box is opened and a page lifted and a word Sonderbehandling lies there like a bone. History moves on, the men age, tribunals fade into textbooks, laws tighten around symbols. In one country, a cover design must be cropped because the image cannot be shown in public. In another, a museum exhibits the same image under glass with a label. We make choices about what is allowed to be seen, and those choices build the story our children inherit. Somewhere in South America, there is still a neighborhood where toasts are given to grandfathers with uniforms folded away in trunks. Somewhere in Alabama, there is an old photograph of a German engineer smiling at a chalkboard drawing of a rocket that would pierce the night. Somewhere at sea level, a survivor once rolled up his sleeve and said, "That matters to walk through Paperclip is to walk through a room where the air feels slightly thinner than it should. You are aware of the door behind you and the door ahead, and the knowledge that neither leads outside. You look at the shelves, affidavits, visas, Middles, and you realize that the future we live in was built not only by heroes or villains, but by negotiations between necessity and shame. The machines we cherish are real, and so are the ghosts in their wiring. We will keep flying, we will keep curing. We will keep refining the instruments that let us see farther and think faster. But if ethics is to mean anything on the other side of victory, we must also keep turning pages in rooms where the light is unforgiving. We must remember that talent is not innocence and usefulness is not absolution. And when we look up at the photographs of rockets climbing, we should let our eyes fall, just once, to the margins of the documents that made those photographs possible and read what is written there.
Paperclip was a bridge we built over a chasm, steel laid across bone, progress spanning a silence we chose not to fill. We crossed it, and on the far side we found the future we wanted, carrying with it the past we tried to leave behind. Some bargains fade with time. This one still hums in the engines.